My
When I
husband
think
handed
back on
me
it
a black
now, I see
garbage
the
bag
path so
and
clearly,
coldly
every
told me
step
to
I had to
pack my
take to get
life.
here. And there's not a
Outside,
single thing I would
violent thunder
change.
shook the foundation of our house. Within the hour, I drove to my wealthy parents' house, begging for shelter from the freezing rain. My father opened his oak door, looked down at his 3 shivering grandchildren, told me I should have kept my husband happier, and slammed the door right in my face. My sister laughed at my misery through the speakerphone. My brother told me to call an Uber. I picked up that soaking wet garbage bag, walked back to my beat-up car, and whispered 4 words that would become their absolute ruin. You will regret this. My name is Claire, 33 years old and a professional estate liquidator. Before I show you how I executed the perfect revenge, let me know where you are watching from in the comments. Hit the like button and subscribe if you believe karma always collects its debts. 3 hours before I stood in that freezing rain, my entire reality was violently dismantled. My job as an estate liquidator meant I spent my days sifting through the remnants of other people's lives, finding hidden value in items most people threw away. I had an eye for recognizing worth where others saw only garbage. It is a bitter irony that I could not apply that same vision to my own marriage. I had left work early that afternoon after closing a difficult contract. I drove back to our suburban home expecting to find the house empty. Instead, I walked up the stairs, opened the door to the master bedroom, and found my husband Greg tangled in our expensive sheets with a woman I immediately recognized. Greg was a software sales director. The woman was Ashley, his young intern. There was no sudden panic. There was no desperate scramble for clothes or frantic apologies. The sheer audacity of what happened next still burns in my memory. Greg simply sat up completely unbothered and looked at me with a cold smirk. Ashley pulled the sheet up not out of shame, but looking at me as if I was the one interrupting their private moment. I demanded an explanation. I demanded that he get out of my house immediately. Greg let out a cruel laugh. He casually walked over to his dresser, pulled out a thick, heavy envelope, and threw it hard against my chest. It fell to the floor, spilling pages of banking documents. It was a joint credit card statement. I stared down at the bold printed numbers. The balance was $45,000. Greg had systematically maxed out every line of joint credit we shared. He had spent it on luxury vacations, expensive dinners, designer bags for Ashley, and luxury hotel rooms. He had drained our joint checking accounts to fuel a secret life, leaving the massive debt attached to my name, as well as his. I felt the air leave my lungs. I told him he was out of his mind if he thought I was leaving my home. That was when Greg delivered the first calculated blow of his trap. He smiled a dark, predatory smile and reminded me of a financial decision we made 5 years ago. When we bought the house, Greg convinced me to put the deed entirely in his mother's name to secure a better interest rate and avoid certain tax liabilities. I had trusted my husband. I had signed the paperwork, believing we were building a future together. Now, he was weaponizing that trust to destroy me. "You are the one leaving Claire," he said. His voice was completely devoid of emotion. "This is my mother's property. You have absolutely zero legal right to stand in this bedroom." I refused to move. I told him he could not do this to the mother of his children. Greg walked over to his nightstand, picked up his phone, and dialed a number. He told me that if I did not have my things packed and my children out of the house in exactly 10 minutes, he would call the police and report me as a hostile trespasser. He promised he would tell the authorities I was having a mental breakdown and creating an unsafe environment for the kids. He had planned every single detail. He knew exactly how to corner me. Panic set in. I ran down the hallway to the children's rooms. Leo is 8, Mia is 6, Sam is barely 3. They were confused and frightened by the sudden chaos. I pulled open their closets. Greg had locked the storage room where we kept the actual luggage. I had no choice but to run to the kitchen, grab a handful of black garbage bags, and stuff them with whatever clothes, shoes, and basic necessities I could grab in a blind rush. Ashley stood in the hallway, leaning against the doorframe, watching me struggle with 3 crying children and bags of clothes. She sipped a glass of water, looking at me with pure disdain. I bundled my 3 young children into my aging, highly unreliable sedan just as the winter storm broke outside. The sky turned a dark gray and freezing rain began to pour down in relentless sheets. I had exactly $5,000 in a separate emergency savings account. It was my entire life savings money I had hidden away from my job liquidating estates. Everything else had been annihilated by Greg. I put the car in gear and drove away from the only home my children knew. I gripped the steering wheel so hard my bare knuckles turned white. The rain battered the windshield, making it almost impossible to see. I desperately needed a safe haven. I needed my family. I turned the car toward the wealthy suburbs where my parents lived, completely unaware that my family was about to deliver a betrayal far more devastating than anything my husband had just done. My old aging sedan heater rattled uselessly against freezing rain lashing the windshield. I gripped the steering wheel tightly while the wipers barely cleared the deluge. In the back seat, Sam let out a piercing wail. He was terrified of the loud thunder shaking our small car. Leo leaned over his car seat, his 8-year-old face pinched with worry. "It is okay, Sammy," he whispered, trying to wrap his own thin jacket around his little brother. "Mom is going to fix this, right, Mom?" Mia sniffled quietly beside him, wiping her eyes with her wet sleeve. "Where are we going, Mom? Are we going to Grandma and Grandpa's house?" I forced my voice to stay completely steady despite my fear. "Yes, sweetie. We are going to see Grandpa Richard and Grandma Patricia. They have plenty of warm rooms. We are just going to stay there until I sort things out with Dad." I tried to sound convincing, but a cold knot of dread formed in my stomach. Turning onto the highway toward the affluent gated communities, I could not stop bitter memories from flooding my mind. My parents, Richard and Patricia, built their entire identities around wealth, status, and appearances. In our family, you were only as valuable as the prestige you brought to our name. There was a strict hierarchy, and I had always resided at the very bottom. My older brother Harrison was the undisputed golden child. He was a ruthless finance executive who lived and breathed corporate ambition. When Harrison was accepted into an Ivy League university, my parents threw a lavish party to celebrate. My father wrote a check for his entire tuition without blinking an eye, calling it a vital investment. My younger sister Brittany was another story entirely. She ran a failing fashion boutique downtown that bled money every single month. When her business hit the rocks, my parents casually handed her $100,000. They did not want the embarrassment of explaining a failed business to country club friends, so they bankrolled her illusion. But my path was entirely different. I had chosen a career getting my hands dirty sorting through dusty attics and forgotten basements. I found value in things other people discarded, a concept my parents found deeply embarrassing. When I gave birth to Sam, there were severe complications requiring emergency surgery. Greg had conveniently switched his insurance plan, leaving us with a staggering pile of medical bills. I remembered sitting in their pristine living room asking my parents for a small loan to keep us afloat while I recovered. Patricia had looked at me over the rim of her porcelain teacup, her expression utterly devoid of maternal warmth. She told me I needed to learn financial responsibility and that bailing me out would not teach me character. They refused to give me a single dime, forcing me to liquidate every personal asset I had, just to survive the medical debt. I pushed those toxic memories down as I finally turned onto their street. The massive wrought iron gates of their neighborhood loomed ahead. I punched in the access code I still remembered from holiday visits. The gates swung open heavily, and I drove my battered sedan up the long, perfectly manicured driveway leading to their sprawling estate. Their mansion stood illuminated by warm landscape lighting, looking secure and impenetrable against the violent storm. I parked the car near the grand stone entryway. I grabbed the soaking wet garbage bag full of our clothes and told the kids to run for the covered porch. We stood shivering under the massive archway. Rain dripped from my hair and soaked completely through my thin jacket. The kids were practically turning blue from the cold. I pressed the doorbell, hearing the melodic chime echo deep inside the massive house. Every second felt like an eternity. Finally, the heavy oak door swung open. My father, Richard, stood in the doorway. He was holding a crystal glass of bourbon, his other hand resting in the pocket of his expensive cashmere sweater. He looked perfectly comfortable, radiating the smug security of a man who had never faced a real crisis in his life. The smell of roasted garlic and warm central heating spilled out from the house, a cruel, agonizing contrast to the freezing wind whipping around us on the porch. He looked down at Leo, Mia, and Sam, who were trembling violently. Then his gaze shifted to the wet garbage bag in my hand. His expression did not soften. There was no shock, no fatherly concern, no immediate rush to bring his freezing grandchildren inside. His face hardened into a mask of pure judgment. "Dad, please!" I gasped, my teeth chattering uncontrollably. "Greg locked us out. He is having an affair with his intern and he maxed out our credit cards. The house is in his mother's name and he threatened to call the police if we did not leave. Please just let the kids sleep in one of the guest rooms tonight." Richard took a slow sip of his bourbon. He looked at me with an expression of absolute disgust. He did not even look at the children again. His voice was sharp, steady, and completely void of empathy. "A successful marriage is a woman's responsibility, Claire," he said coldly. "If Greg is stepping out with a younger woman, it is clearly because you failed to keep your husband happy and satisfied at home." I stared at him, unable to comprehend the words coming out of his mouth. My children were freezing. I was begging for basic shelter, and my own father was blaming me for my husband's infidelity. Patricia appeared in the hallway behind him. My mother did not rush forward to gather her grandchildren. She stood behind her husband's shoulder, arms crossed, her face a perfect mirror of his disdain. "You are creating a public scandal, Claire," she said. "Go back, apologize to Greg, and fix this mess. We are not running a charity shelter for a failed wife." I pleaded one last time, begging them to just take the kids for the night while I slept in the car. Richard shook his head, stating that letting me stay would only encourage my victim mentality. He told me not to come back until I had salvaged my marriage and my dignity. Without another single word, he stepped back and slammed the heavy oak door directly in my face. The sound of the latch clicking into place cut through the thunder, leaving us standing entirely alone in the freezing dark. I guided my soaking wet children back to the freezing sedan. Water sloshed in my cheap shoes with every heavy step away from my parents' fortress. I bundled Leo, Mia, and Sam into the back seat, wrapping them in the damp clothes from the garbage bag. The car engine sputtered and choked before finally turning over. The heater blasted a weak stream of lukewarm air that did absolutely nothing against the biting winter chill. A harsh yellow fuel light flickered on the dashboard, warning me that my time and resources were running out. I had $5,000 sitting in a savings account, but I could not access a single penny until the banks opened on Monday morning. Greg seized everything else. I needed immediate shelter for the weekend. I pulled out my phone, my fingers numb and trembling. I had to swallow my pride and keep trying. I dialed my older brother, Harrison. He was a 36-year-old finance executive who lived entirely alone in a sprawling, modern 5-bedroom house across town. He had more than enough space. He had guest wings he never even used. The phone rang 4 times before he finally answered. He sounded incredibly annoyed immediately, complaining about the late hour and how he was preparing for a crucial early morning conference call with overseas investors. I did not let him finish his corporate rant. I spoke quickly, explaining the catastrophic betrayal by Greg. I told him our parents had just locked us out in the pouring rain. I begged him sibling to let us crash on his floor just for a couple of nights. Harrison let out a long, dramatic sigh of pure inconvenience. He did not ask if my children were safe. He did not ask if I had eaten. He immediately launched into a clinical, business-like breakdown of why my desperate request was unacceptable. He told me his house was professionally staged and not child-proofed. He claimed having 3 loud kids running around would disrupt his focus and potentially damage his high-end imported furniture. He coldly stated that I should have managed my finances better so I could afford a hotel in emergencies. When I pleaded again, pointing out that his own niece and nephews were freezing in a car, he replied that he was not a rescue service for my poor life choices. He told me to figure it out like an adult, and abruptly hung up. The line went dead. I sat in the dark parking lot of a closed gas station, the rain hammering the roof of the car. Desperation pushed me to my absolute limit. I had one final option. My younger sister, Brittany. She was 29, running a failing boutique our parents bankrolled. She was married to Jamal, a 31-year-old African-American public relations executive. Jamal was a smooth-talking opportunist who spent his entire life sucking up to my father. He mirrored Richard's toxic behavior perfectly to secure his permanent place in the family wealth. I hated the idea of calling them, but I needed money for a cheap motel. I just needed a couple of $100s to get my kids out of the freezing car and into a warm bed. I dialed Brittany's number. Jamal answered the phone. His voice was loud, excessively cheerful, and layered with a fake warmth that immediately made my skin crawl. I could hear distinct background noise. The clinking of expensive crystal glasses, the low murmur of conversation, the soft jazz playing in the background. They were hosting a dinner party. I swallowed every ounce of pride I possessed. I quickly explained the dire situation to Jamal. I told him Greg had thrown us out, that my credit cards were maxed out by Greg's affair, and that the kids were literally sleeping in the car. I asked him if he could spot me $200 for a motel room. Jamal did not respond to me privately. Instead, I heard the unmistakable sound of a phone being placed on a hard surface, followed by a hollow echo. He had intentionally put me on speakerphone right in the middle of their elegant dining room. The background chatter abruptly stopped. Jamal repeated my request loudly to the entire room, turning my desperate plea for my children's safety into a piece of dinner theater. I heard Brittany's sharp, mocking laughter cut through the silence. She did not express a single ounce of sisterly concern. Instead, her voice rang out clear and cruel for all their guests to hear. "Do not give her a single dime, Jamal," she commanded. "She is a sinking ship. She is a pathetic failure who could not even keep a man who worked in software sales. Let her figure it out herself." I sat in the freezing car, the phone pressed hard against my ear, listening to my own family dissect my misery as entertainment. I heard my father's familiar voice in the background grunting his hearty approval of Brittany's harsh assessment. He must have driven straight to their dinner party after locking me out. Jamal spoke directly into the phone, his public relations trained voice dripping with heavy condescension. He told me that giving me money would be a bad investment and a terrible look for their personal brand. He casually suggested I start an online fundraiser if I was truly that desperate for a handout. He laughed, a deep booming sound that echoed violently through the speaker, and told me to enjoy the rain. Then he abruptly ended the call. The heavy silence in the car became deafening. I looked at the dark screen of my phone. The rejection was absolute, total, and universally agreed upon by every single person sharing my bloodline. They were all in on it together. They actively enjoyed my suffering because it validated their superiority. I wiped the angry tears from my freezing face. I put the car into drive. I navigated the dark, rain-soaked streets with my fuel gauge needle resting firmly on empty. The yellow warning light glared at me, serving as a harsh reminder of my absolute vulnerability. I had $5,000 locked away in my hidden emergency account, but until the banks opened on Monday, those funds were completely useless. I needed immediate refuge for the night. I drove until the massive glowing blue sign of a 24-hour Walmart cut through the heavy downpour. I steered my battered sedan into the furthest corner of the vast empty asphalt parking lot, positioning us directly under a flickering street lamp in hopes of providing some small measure of security. I turned off the engine to conserve whatever gas fumes remained in the tank. The winter chill invaded the car almost instantly. I climbed over the center console into the back seat, pulling Leo, Mia, and Sam tightly against my chest. We huddled together under the harsh artificial light, using the few damp coats and sweaters I had blindly shoved into the garbage bags. The sheer humiliation felt like a physical weight pressing down on my lungs. I was a hard-working professional woman. I was a dedicated mother who had spent her entire life trying to do everything right. Yet here I was, reduced to sleeping in a freezing vehicle with my shivering babies, because my cheating husband and my toxic relatives were monsters. I held my children close, listening to the steady drumming of the rain against the metal roof. We had been sitting there for perhaps an hour. The kids had finally drifted into a restless, shivering sleep. Suddenly, a sharp, violent rapping on the driver's side window made my heart jump straight into my throat. I looked up to see a police officer shining a heavy, blinding flashlight directly into the car. Absolute panic seized my body. Greg's earlier threat echoed loudly in my mind. He had explicitly promised to call the authorities and claim I was unstable. I carefully opened the car door, stepping out into the freezing rain to face the officer. He was tall and stern, his dark uniform slick with water. He demanded to know exactly what I was doing, parked in a commercial lot in the middle of the night with 3 small children in the back seat. I tried to explain my situation. I stumbled over my words, my teeth chattering uncontrollably from the biting wind. I told him we had nowhere else to go, and that we were simply waiting out the winter storm until morning. The officer's expression remained entirely hard and unyielding. He explained the law to me with brutal clinical clarity. The temperatures were dropping below freezing. The children were at immediate risk of hypothermia. He told me that if I did not have a safe, heated environment to take them to, right this second, he was legally obligated to call Child Protective Services. He plainly stated they would take my children into emergency state custody. The sheer terror of losing my kids paralyzed me completely. I could not let the state take them away. I could not hand Greg the exact legal ammunition he needed to destroy me in family court. I swallowed every last drop of my pride. I begged the officer for a chance and promised I would leave the premises immediately. He gave me the address to a local women and children emergency shelter downtown. He told me he would follow closely behind my vehicle to ensure we arrived safely at the facility. The drive to the shelter was a blur of silent tears and gripping fear. We arrived at a nondescript brick building surrounded by a high chain-link fence. The intake process was deeply degrading. We sat in a small room with harsh fluorescent lighting that buzzed incessantly above our heads. The strong chemical smell of industrial bleach burned my nose. I had to answer deeply invasive questions about my marriage, my financial ruin, and my physical safety. The shelter volunteers were perfectly kind, but the stark reality of my situation was undeniable. I was officially a destitute homeless mother seeking government refuge. We were eventually led to a small, sterile room containing 2 thin metal cots. I laid my exhausted children down, covering them with coarse, scratchy blankets. I sat upright in a hard plastic chair by the door, wide awake, guarding them, until the sun finally rose over the city skyline. The next morning, the violent storm had passed, leaving behind a cold gray sky. I was sitting in the shelter communal cafeteria, feeding my children plain instant oatmeal from styrofoam bowls. A shelter worker approached our table looking deeply uncomfortable. She handed me a thick manila envelope. A private courier had just delivered it to the front desk, explicitly demanding my immediate signature. I looked at the return address. It belonged to one of the most ruthless, expensive family law firms in the entire state. I tore open the heavy envelope. The legal documents inside detailed exactly how thoroughly Greg had planned my total destruction. He had officially filed for divorce, but it was not just a standard filing. He had filed an emergency ex parte motion demanding full and immediate legal and physical custody of Leo, Mia, and Sam. I scanned the crisp white pages, my blood running completely cold as I read his justification. Greg had masterfully weaponized the exact situation he and my toxic family had forced me into. His high-priced lawyers argued that I had abandoned the marital home erratically and dangerously. They stated that I was currently residing in a homeless shelter, proving I was financially destitute and incapable of providing a stable, secure environment for the children. The documents falsely claimed I was suffering from severe mental instability and presented a direct, immediate danger to the kids' well-being. He demanded child support from me. He demanded I be restricted to supervised visitation only. The trap had been meticulously engineered and flawlessly executed. Greg knew I had limited funds. He knew my image-obsessed family would abandon me because he knew exactly how toxic and cruel they truly were. He had orchestrated my homelessness so he could use it as undeniable legal proof of my unfitness as a mother. He fully intended to take my children, keep the house, keep our assets, and leave me utterly destroyed, buried under $45,000 of his fraudulent credit card debt. I sat at that cafeteria table, staring at the legal papers, designed to erase my entire existence as a mother. The fear vanished completely. It was replaced by a cold, calculating, and absolute fury. I folded the legal papers carefully and slid them back into the heavy manila envelope. The trembling in my hands had stopped entirely. I gathered my 3 children and walked them down the long, sterile hallway to the subsidized daycare center run by the shelter. Leaving them there was one of the hardest things I have ever done. Leo held tightly to my hand, his eyes wide with silent questions. Mia clung to her younger brother, trying to be brave. I knelt on the scuffed linoleum floor, looking each of them directly in the eyes. I promised them with absolute certainty that this situation was only temporary. I told them their mother was going to work to fix everything. I kissed their foreheads, handed them over to the daycare volunteers, and walked out the heavy security doors into the crisp morning air. The banks were finally open. I had $5,000 to my name and a ticking clock counting down to a custody hearing that could strip my children away forever. I needed a ruthless lawyer and I needed money fast. I drove straight to the estate liquidation company, where I had spent the last several years working in the shadows. The business was run by an aging proprietor named Thomas, who was just weeks away from permanent retirement. The warehouse office was already half empty, filled with cardboard boxes and stacked inventory waiting to be auctioned off. I marched directly into his office, bypassing his secretary. I was not there to ask for a modest favor. I was there to beg for my survival. I laid my situation out for him in rapid, efficient sentences. I told him I needed double shifts, overnight hours, weekend appraisals, or whatever grueling work he had available. I offered to clear out the worst hoarder houses on our roster single-handedly. I explained that I was facing a brutal custody battle against a man trying to bankrupt me into submission, and I desperately needed an influx of immediate cash to secure legal representation. Thomas looked at me with deep, sympathetic exhaustion. He took off his reading glasses and rubbed his eyes. He told me he was shutting the business down entirely by the end of the month. There were no new contracts coming in. There was no overtime to give. The company was liquidating its own assets. My heart plummeted into my stomach. The single avenue I had for quick, reliable income was closing its doors. But then Thomas leaned forward, resting his elbows on his cluttered desk. He told me he had one final asset left on the company books that he was desperate to get rid of before finalizing his retirement. It was a massive abandoned industrial warehouse on the outskirts of the city. He had acquired it blindly during a bulk commercial estate buyout 2 years ago and had never even bothered to send a team to inspect it. Thomas explained the property was heavily dilapidated and classified as a toxic headache. The city was demanding expensive environmental cleanups and threatening heavy fines for structural code violations. He had zero desire to deal with the bureaucratic nightmare or the hazardous waste removal in his old age. He wanted the property entirely off his hands today. He looked me dead in the eye and made a highly unorthodox proposition. He offered to transfer the full ownership and all salvage rights of the property directly to me. He wanted exactly $5,000 to cover his immediate legal transfer fees and wash his hands of the liability forever. I stood perfectly still. $5,000. It was the exact amount sitting in my hidden emergency account. It was every single penny I possessed in the entire world. The risk was astronomical. If I handed over my life savings, I would be plunging myself into absolute financial zero. I could be buying a worthless, crumbling pile of hazardous concrete that would drown me in city fines faster than Greg ever could. But I was an estate liquidator. I possessed a sharp, highly trained eye for uncovering immense hidden value where others saw only garbage and liability. Thomas was a paperwork man who avoided getting his hands dirty. He had never stepped foot inside that building. I calculated the odds in my head. A commercial industrial property from a bulk estate sale always held secrets. It was a terrifying gamble, but playing it safe had already left me homeless in a freezing car. I looked at Thomas and accepted the deal without a single ounce of hesitation. I drove immediately to my bank and withdrew my entire emergency fund in crisp cash. Holding that money felt like holding the last breath of oxygen I had left. I drove back to the office and placed the stack of bills directly onto his desk. He brought in his notary immediately. I signed the transfer documents initialing every liability waiver and accepting the property completely as is. Thomas handed me a heavy rusted ring of keys and a thick manila folder containing the deed. I walked out of the building with nothing left to my name but the clothes on my back, a cheap car, and the legal rights to an environmental disaster zone. I was officially flat broke. I had no money for food, no money for gas, and absolutely no money for a lawyer to fight Greg. But as I held those rusted keys in my hand, my cold fury ignited into a blazing fire of determination. I was going to rip that warehouse apart brick by brick until I found a way to buy back my children and destroy the people who put us in that shelter. I refused to let my toxic family win this battle. I would build a new, ruthless empire right from the absolute bottom. Greg thought he buried me beneath his massive debt. He thought I would crumble and surrender. He was completely wrong about my survival instincts. I drove to the industrial district. The warehouse loomed against the dark gray sky like a rotting concrete beast. Thomas was not exaggerating about the environmental hazards. Rusted chain-link fencing sagged under the weight of overgrown dead vines. Faded yellow signs warned of structural instability and asbestos. I unlocked the steel door and was hit by the suffocating stench of decay and accumulated dust. The interior was a cavernous black hole, filled to the ceiling with towering mountains of water, damaged cardboard boxes, shattered pallets, and rusted industrial machinery. I had zero budget to hire a crew. I had to do the agonizing physical labor with my own bare hands. My days became a brutal, torturous cycle of survival. When the sun came up, I sat in the cramped public library using their free internet to research family law. I filed my own legal responses pro se because I could not afford a lawyer. Greg's high-priced legal team buried me under mountains of aggressive discovery demands and motion filings deliberately designed to exhaust me into giving up custody. They requested every financial record, every text message, and every psychological evaluation they could legally demand. I fought them back with cold clinical precision, using the free legal aid clinics to format my documents perfectly. Then I would pick up Leo, Mia, and Max from the shelter daycare, feed them the bland institutional dinner, and read them to sleep on those rigid metal cots. Once my children were asleep, I would sneak out of the shelter and drive to the warehouse. I bought a sledgehammer, work gloves, and a respirator mask using the last crumpled bills in my purse. Night after night, I worked under the harsh glare of a single battery-powered construction lantern. I smashed apart rotting wooden crates. I dragged rusted metal pipes out to the scrapyard across the street, negotiating cash by the pound, just so I could buy breakfast for my kids the next morning. My muscles screamed in agony. My hands blistered and bled. The physical pain was excruciating, but it channeled the burning rage I held for my family and my cheating husband. I refused to let my children become collateral damage in Greg's twisted game. But 2 weeks into the grueling labor, my breaking point arrived. The shelter informed me our maximum stay limit was rapidly approaching. Greg's lawyers filed a motion for an emergency hearing to finalize the primary custody transfer. I was running out of time. I stood in the middle of the dark, damp warehouse covered in toxic dust and sweat. I stared at a massive, towering wall of plaster blocking the rear section of the building. My flashlight beam flickered and died, leaving me in near total darkness. A wave of blinding, overwhelming frustration crashed over me. I gripped the heavy wooden handle of my sledgehammer. I swung the sledgehammer with every ounce of fury and hatred in my body. I aimed directly at the center of that massive, thick plaster wall. The heavy steel head smashed through the surface with a deafening crack. Instead of hitting solid brick, the hammer punched straight through the drywall into cold, empty space. I pulled the tool back, deeply confused. I grabbed my backup flashlight from my tool belt and shined the beam into the jagged hole. A cold rush of dry, perfectly conditioned air blew out from the opening, hitting my sweat-soaked face. It was not a structural barrier. It was a fake partition deliberately built to hide a massive rear wing of the property. I swung the sledgehammer again and again, ripping away huge chunks of drywall and metal framing until the opening was large enough to step through. I clicked on my high-powered flashlight and walked into the hidden chamber. My breath completely hitched in my throat. I stood perfectly still, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped drum. The secret wing was immaculate. It was fully climate-controlled, powered by an independent solar generator running quietly on the roof. The concrete floor was sealed and polished to a flawless shine. Resting on pristine rubber mats in the center of the massive room were four flawless, classic American muscle cars. I recognized them immediately from my years of high-end estate appraisals. There was a pristine 1969 Chevrolet Camaro, a fully restored 1967 Ford Mustang Shelby, a pristine Dodge Charger, and an ultra-rare Pontiac GTO. They were completely covered in protective dust sheets, but their condition was museum quality. My flashlight beam tracked upward, hitting the walls. Hanging securely on custom reinforced mounting brackets were dozens of massive original mid-century modern oil paintings. I recognized the distinct brushstrokes of highly coveted post-war abstract expressionists. I walked closer, examining the signatures and the perfect preservation of the canvases. My highly trained appraiser brain instantly began running the calculations. The classic cars alone were worth millions at a specialized private auction. The artwork, if authenticated, could easily double that figure. I had bought a $5,000 toxic dump and uncovered a forgotten $15 million gold mine. I dropped to my knees on the polished concrete floor, covering my mouth to stifle a scream of pure disbelief. I had the money. I had the power to buy back my children and destroy Greg completely. But a terrifying legal reality instantly hit me like a bucket of ice water. We were still legally married. The divorce was not finalized. If Greg or his ruthless lawyers discovered this warehouse held a $15 million fortune, they would instantly demand half of it as a marital asset. He would use his high-powered legal team to freeze the property, seize the vehicles, and drag the artwork into court. I had to protect this empire at all costs. I could not tell a single soul. I had to keep playing the part of the desperate homeless mother, while quietly sitting on a mountain of unimaginable, absolute power. The fluorescent lights of the family courthouse hummed with a sterile, oppressive energy that matched the brutal reality of my mourning. I sat completely alone at the worn wooden defendant table. I wore a faded, oversized gray blouse and scuffed black flats I purchased from a local charity thrift store for $12. My hair was tied in a messy knot, and I deliberately forewent makeup, letting the dark, exhausted circles under my eyes show clearly. I looked exactly like the broken, destitute, and desperate homeless mother Greg wanted the judge to see. Across the heavy mahogany aisle, my soon-to-be ex-husband sat flanked by two sharp-suited, expensive litigators. Greg wore a custom-tailored navy suit and a silver watch that gleamed under the harsh overhead lights. He looked relaxed, confident, and utterly vicious. The absolute depth of my family betrayal became painfully clear before the judge even entered the courtroom. Greg, lead attorney, a ruthless man known for financially bleeding mothers dry, filed a financial disclosure statement with the clerk. As I reviewed my copy, the paper felt like a physical knife twisting in my gut. Greg was not paying his exorbitant legal fees. The retainer had been paid in full by a private trust. It was my father, Richard Trust. My own father was actively funding the legal war to strip my children away from me. Richard and Patricia allied with the man who cheated on their daughter and threw their grandchildren into a freezing storm simply because Greg fit their wealthy image and I did not. They were trying to erase me completely from the family equation. I dug my fingernails into my palms, letting the sharp pain ground me. I swallowed the fiery rage boiling in my chest. I had a $15 million secret safely locked away in a climate-controlled vault, and I needed to protect it by playing the perfect victim. The judge banged his gavel and the emergency custody hearing began. Greg took the witness stand first. It was a masterclass in manipulative gaslighting. He spoke softly, his voice cracking at all the right moments. He told the judge that I had suffered a severe manic episode. He claimed I packed the children in garbage bags and fled our marital home in a blind, irrational rage, while he was simply trying to have a calm discussion about our finances. He wiped a single manufactured tear from his eye as he described the horror of learning his beloved children were sleeping on metal cots in a dangerous public shelter. He omitted Ashley. He omitted changing the locks. He painted himself as the stable, loving provider whose only concern was rescuing Leo, Mia, and Sam from their mother-dangerous delusions. Then his lawyers turned their crosshairs on me. They projected bank statements onto the courtroom monitor. They displayed the $45,000 joint credit card debt. Greg, attorney, practically shouted, pointing directly at me, claiming I squandered the family savings on erratic, compulsive spending sprees. He knew Greg used that money on luxury vacations with his intern, but legally my name was on the account. I sat there in my faded thrift store blouse, absorbing the public humiliation. The lawyer then pulled out the deed transfer for the warehouse. He read the address aloud, calling it a known toxic wasteland. He accused me of taking my last $5,000 and throwing it into a hazardous, crumbling ruin instead of securing a safe apartment for my children. He argued this was undeniable proof of my severe mental instability and sheer unfitness as a parent. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to stand up and fight back. I wanted to slam my fists on the table and yell the truth. I wanted to scream that the toxic wasteland held pristine classic cars and original mid-century art worth more than Greg and my father combined net worth. I wanted to wipe that arrogant, smug smirk off Greg's face by revealing the $15 million empire I now secretly owned. But I bit the inside of my cheek until I tasted copper. If I revealed the asset now, Greg lawyers would immediately file an injunction. They would freeze the warehouse, demand a marital asset split, and use my father's endless funds to tie the property up in brutal litigation for the next decade. I had to remain entirely silent. I had to let them win the battle so I could annihilate them in the war. I kept my head bowed. I let my shoulders slump in total defeat. I allowed silent tears to slip down my cheeks, giving the judge the exact image of a broken, helpless woman. Greg leaned back in his leather chair, crossing his arms with profound satisfaction. During a recess, while the judge reviewed documents, Greg walked past my table toward the hallway. He paused, leaning down, so only I could hear him. He whispered that I should have just stayed quiet and accepted his affair. He told me I was going to lose the kids, lose the divorce, and spend the rest of my pathetic life working minimum wage to pay off his debt. He told me my own parents hated me. I did not react. I did not flinch. I just looked down at my scuffed thrift store shoes. Greg's arrogance was blinding him entirely. He was so busy gloating over his manufactured victory that he was actively digging his own grave. I knew he was committing perjury on the stand. I knew he was hiding his own assets. I was letting him build a massive house of cards on the official court record. Every lie he told, every fake tear he shed, every piece of false evidence his lawyers entered into the system was just another nail in his coffin. Let him think I was a powerless victim. Let my father think his money had crushed me. They were dealing with a woman who had absolutely nothing left to lose, and a secret fortune ready to burn their entire world to ash. The financial discovery phase of our divorce proceedings dragged on for another 3 weeks. Because I was representing myself, I spent every night poring over mountains of redacted banking statements and tax returns under the flickering light of the shelter cafeteria. Greg's legal team had dumped thousands of pages of financial documents on me, trying to bury the truth in an avalanche of paperwork. But they underestimated my professional background. As an estate liquidator, I was trained to track missing assets and uncover hidden wealth. I sat at that cafeteria table, cross-referencing Greg's income statements with our past joint tax filings. That was when I noticed a glaring discrepancy. Greg had earned a lucrative compensation package from his tech company 2 years ago, including a substantial amount of vested stock options. Those shares should have been listed as prime marital assets. Instead, they were completely gone. The official disclosure forms claimed the shares had been cashed out to pay for failed business ventures and anonymous consulting fees. I traced the paper trail through a labyrinth of shell companies and offshore wire transfers. The money had not been lost to bad investments. It had been systematically and intentionally laundered. Greg had liquidated his entire stock portfolio, a sum totaling nearly $3 million in cash, and transferred it completely out of our domestic accounts. I tracked the final destination of the wire transfers to a private offshore trust account located in the Cayman Islands. When I finally uncovered the designated primary beneficiary of that offshore trust, my blood turned to absolute ice. The name on the account was not Greg. The name on the account was Richard. My own father had actively conspired with my abusive ex-husband to hide millions of dollars in marital assets. Richard had used his elite financial connections to set up the offshore account, specifically to help Greg bleed me dry. My father had watched me stand on his front porch in the freezing rain, begging for a safe place for his grandchildren to sleep, knowing perfectly well that he was currently holding the very money that rightfully belonged to me. He had helped the man who destroyed my marriage ensure that I would be left completely penniless and crushed under a mountain of fraudulent credit card debt. The sheer magnitude of the betrayal took my breath away. They were not just toxic or unsupportive. They were calculated, ruthless criminals who viewed my destruction as a necessary business transaction to protect their own wealth and image. I brought this devastating evidence to the final custody hearing. I stood before the judge and laid out the meticulous paper trail demonstrating exactly how Greg had hidden our assets with the direct assistance of my father. Greg's expensive lawyers immediately launched into aggressive damage control, objecting loudly and claiming the documents were circumstantial or misunderstood by an uneducated pro se litigant. The judge, a stern, unyielding woman, peered over her glasses at the financial web I had uncovered. While she acknowledged the severe irregularities, she firmly stated that untangling an international offshore trust would require a separate, lengthy, and highly expensive civil litigation process. It was a battle I currently had zero capital to fight. Greg smirked, knowing his high-priced legal wall was holding strong against my lack of immediate resources. However, the judge then turned her sharp attention to the primary matter of child custody. Greg had built his entire case on painting me as an unstable homeless woman while portraying himself as the dedicated provider. But I had brought my own carefully documented evidence. I presented the court with years of school pickup logs, pediatric medical records, and daycare sign-in sheets. Greg's signature did not appear on a single document. I provided sworn affidavits from the children's teachers and pediatricians stating they had never even met Greg. I showed the judge the exact timeline of Greg moving his young intern into our marital bed less than 24 hours after kicking his own children out into a winter storm. The judge saw directly through Greg's manufactured facade. She noted his complete absence from the children's daily lives and admonished his aggressive tactics to weaponize my temporary financial hardship, which he had clearly engineered. She struck down his demand for full custody with brutal efficiency. The gavel came down hard. I was officially granted primary physical and legal custody of Leo, Mia, and Sam. Greg was granted only standard alternating weekend visitation, a schedule I knew he would never actually utilize, because he fundamentally did not care about the kids. He had only fought for custody to torture me and use them as leverage. The victory was monumental, but it came with a staggering immediate cost. The judge finalized the division of our visible domestic assets. Because the offshore funds were tied up in complex international litigation I could not afford to pursue, I was left legally responsible for half of the $45,000 credit card debt. Greg kept the house because it was legally deeded to his mother. I was granted a meager child support order that Greg's lawyers would inevitably fight and delay for months. On paper, I was officially a bankrupt single mother drowning in debt with absolutely no family support network and no permanent home. I walked out of the heavy double doors of the family courthouse holding the official custody decree tightly against my chest. The crisp afternoon air hit my face. Greg walked past me in the corridor, flanked by his smug legal team and his new young girlfriend. He threw me a look of pure, unadulterated victory, believing he had successfully left me to rot in the gutter. He thought he had completely won. My father probably thought the exact same thing, sitting comfortably in his pristine mansion, counting the millions he helped steal from his own daughter. They had successfully rendered me legally broke and publicly humiliated. But as I walked down the courthouse steps toward the shelter to pick up my children, I felt a terrifying, powerful calm settle deep into my bones. I had my kids. They were legally safe from Greg forever. And resting heavily in my cheap thrift store purse was the rusted key to an abandoned industrial warehouse. I was holding a secret $15 million fortune that they knew absolutely nothing about. The tears were gone. The fear was gone. The desperation had evaporated. I was going to use every single penny hidden inside that climate-controlled vault to build a massive, untouchable empire. And then I was going to ruthlessly and completely destroy theirs. 2 years evaporated into a relentless, meticulously calculated grind. I did not waste a single second celebrating my custody victory. The moment the judge banged her gavel, I shifted into absolute execution mode. I contacted a highly exclusive, discreet auction house based in Geneva. I bypassed their standard intake agents and went directly to a senior acquisitions director specializing in mid-century modern provenance. I sent him a single encrypted photograph of one painting with a close-up of the signature. He was on a private jet to my city within 24 hours. I met him at the warehouse under the cover of darkness. He authenticated the entire collection with trembling hands. We arranged unmarked transport trucks to extract the entire inventory at 3 in the morning. The entire operation was completely invisible to the outside world. Over the next 8 months, the auctions took place across private international markets. I watched secure live streams from my cheap laptop in a rented studio apartment, while wealthy collectors ignited fierce bidding wars over the inventory I had pulled from a rotting, toxic wasteland. The 1969 Chevrolet Camaro shattered auction records. The abstract paintings alone brought in astronomical figures. When the final hammer fell and the brutal taxes and exorbitant auction house fees were completely settled, my secure offshore accounts registered a staggering influx of capital. I was officially sitting on $15 million in pure liquid cash. I did not buy designer clothes or post vacation photos. I immediately hired a top-tier corporate attorney bound by ironclad non-disclosure agreements. I instructed him to build an impenetrable corporate fortress. We established a blind trust and a heavily shielded limited liability company registered in Delaware to ensure absolute anonymity. I named the corporation Phoenix Holdings. On paper, I was simply a low-level asset manager. In reality, I owned the entire financial entity, free and clear. With my wealth legally protected behind corporate walls, I began quietly upgrading my children's lives. I purchased a beautiful 5-bedroom home nestled deep in a heavily wooded private community far away from my toxic family's social circles. I bought the property entirely in cash through the LLC, leaving zero public paper trail linking my name to the deed. The house featured a massive backyard, state-of-the-art security systems, and warm, bright bedrooms for Leo, Mia, and Sam. I enrolled all 3 children in an elite private school under strict privacy protocols, ensuring my ex-husband could never track their location or discover their new standard of living. I hired private tutors, a nutritionist, and a discreet household staff to help manage our daily schedules. Behind the towering stone gates of our new estate, we were finally thriving. My children went to sleep every single night feeling safe, warm, and deeply loved, free from the chaos that had previously defined our existence. But outside those secure gates, I maintained an absolute ghost profile. I meticulously crafted an illusion of ongoing poverty and desperate struggle. I kept my aging, unreliable sedan specifically for public appearances and forced interactions. When I had to drop the kids off at the designated neutral location for Greg's court-ordered visitation, I made sure to wear faded jeans and cheap, worn-out shoes. Greg never utilized his full visitation time anyway. He would show up an hour late, hand the kids off to his new young wife, Ashley, and spend the entire brief exchange looking at me with pure condescending pity. He continued to send his meager child support checks with arrogant little notes attached, telling me not to spend it all on cheap wine. I deposited his pathetic checks into an account I never touched, letting him feed his own massive ego while I secretly controlled millions. My parents and siblings fully believed the exact same fabricated narrative. Through the grapevine of mutual acquaintances, I knew Richard and Patricia were actively telling their wealthy country club friends that I was an embarrassing failure who had ruined my own life. They painted themselves as the tragic victims of an ungrateful daughter who refused to take their good advice and salvage her marriage. Harrison was too busy ruthlessly climbing the corporate finance ladder to even remember I existed. Brittany and Jamal continued to run their failing boutique, subsidized by my father's stolen millions, laughing at my perceived misery during their lavish dinner parties. To all of them, I was still the ugly dropout. I was the pathetic single mother working a dead-end job, struggling to put generic brand food on the table. They desperately needed me to be a failure because my absolute destruction was the foundational pillar of their collective superiority complex. They had absolutely no clue that the woman they mocked was secretly operating a highly aggressive private equity firm. They did not know that Phoenix Holdings was rapidly expanding, acquiring distressed commercial assets and turning massive profits in the shadows of the financial sector. I spent my days in a sleek private downtown office directing high-level acquisitions and multiplying my wealth with cold, clinical precision. My past experience as an estate liquidator gave me a lethal advantage in the commercial real estate market. I knew exactly how to spot failing assets, evaluate toxic debt, and strike when the current owners were most desperate. I was building a massive financial war chest, waiting patiently for the perfect moment to strike back. I let my family revel in their stolen millions. I let Greg believe he had outsmarted the legal system by hiding his tech shares in my father's offshore accounts. I watched them build their glittering empires on a foundation of absolute fraud, knowing exactly how fragile that foundation truly was. I simply needed to quietly bide my time and wait for the wind to change. All the traps were set. The money was secured. The phoenix had already risen from the ashes. Now it was finally time to watch them all burn. The toxic arrogance of my family reached an entirely new level of delusion during the third year of my independence. Richard, Harrison, Jamal, and my ex-husband Greg decided they were invincible. They pooled their entire collective net worth into a single massive venture. It was a hyper-luxury commercial real estate development located right in the most expensive district of the city. The project was designed to be a glittering monument to their own massive egos. It featured high-end retail spaces, luxury penthouses, and an exclusive rooftop club. But the foundation of their glittering new empire was built entirely on stolen money. They used the millions of dollars Greg had successfully laundered into my father's offshore accounts as the primary seed capital to secure their massive construction loans. They were literally using the money they stole from me and my children to finance their aggressive expansion. Their arrogance was absolutely staggering. They constantly flaunted their apparent wealth across every social media platform available. I watched from my secure anonymous accounts as Greg posted pictures of his lavish wedding to Ashley. He bought her a massive diamond ring, and they hosted a $200,000 reception at a private vineyard. Harrison posted daily updates from the construction site wearing a custom-tailored suit and a hard hat, pretending to be a real estate mogul. Jamal used his public relations expertise to secure puff pieces in local business magazines, praising my father Richard as a visionary developer. They believed they had completely won the game of life. They thought they were untouchable titans of industry. They were so blinded by their own extreme vanity that they completely ignored the massive financial risks they were taking by over-leveraging their personal assets to fund the luxury development. I continued to play my part perfectly. I never let my mask slip. I deliberately drove my rusted sedan across town to shop at a notoriously cheap discount grocery store, specifically to maintain the illusion of my crushing poverty. I knew members of my family occasionally passed through that area, and I wanted to ensure my cover story remained absolutely flawless. On a rainy Tuesday afternoon, the inevitable confrontation finally happened. I was pushing a squeaky shopping cart down the canned goods aisle, wearing a faded, oversized sweater and scuffed sneakers. I turned the corner and nearly collided head-on with my sister Brittany and her husband Jamal. They looked completely out of place in the discount store. Brittany was wearing head-to-toe designer clothing, clutching a ridiculously expensive handbag that probably cost more than the average car. Jamal looked every bit the flashy public relations executive, sporting a tailored sports coat and a heavy gold watch. They had apparently stopped in to buy a cheap case of bottled water for a promotional event Brittany was hosting at her failing boutique. The moment they spotted me, Brittany's eyes lit up with predatory excitement. She nudged Jamal and pointed directly at my cart. "Well, look who it is," Brittany announced, her voice artificially loud to ensure the other shoppers in the aisle could hear. "I did not realize you shopped here, Claire." "Actually, wait. Yes, I did. It completely fits your aesthetic." Jamal let out a sharp, condescending laugh. He stepped closer, looking down into my shopping basket with an expression of exaggerated disgust. He pointed a manicured finger at the generic brand cereal and the discounted canned beans I had deliberately selected for my cover story. "Man, that is just bleak," Jamal said, shaking his head. "Are you really feeding my niece and nephews this processed garbage? You know Greg just took Ashley to a Michelin star tasting menu last night. He is doing amazing, by the way. He really leveled up his life after dropping the dead weight." I kept my hands lightly resting on the plastic handle of my shopping cart. I did not flinch. I did not defend myself. I just let them talk. Brittany took a step forward, putting on a mask of fake theatrical pity. "It honestly breaks my heart to see you like this, Claire." She sighed loudly. "Look at you. You look exhausted. Your clothes are a mess. You are pushing a broken cart full of cheap carbohydrates. You have this incredibly sad, stagnant life. If you had just listened to Dad and stopped being so stubborn and difficult, you might not be living like a complete peasant right now. You could have been part of the new luxury development project. The family is making absolute millions, and you are here counting pennies for off-brand soup." Jamal crossed his arms, leaning against the store shelving. "It is all about mindset, Claire," he lectured smoothly. "We have a wealth mindset. We build empires. You have a poverty mindset. That is why you are stuck at the bottom of the food chain. You really should have started that online fundraiser I suggested a few years ago." They waited eagerly for my reaction. They wanted me to cry. They wanted me to yell or defend my choices so they could laugh at my desperation. They needed my tears to validate their stolen wealth. But I did not give them a single ounce of satisfaction. I looked directly into Brittany's eyes and then shifted my gaze to Jamal. I let a slow, completely genuine smile spread across my face. It was not a defensive smile. It was the calm, serene smile of an apex predator looking at trapped prey. "I am doing exactly what I need to be doing, Brittany," I said softly. "I am perfectly happy with my life right now. I hope your new real estate project brings you exactly what you deserve." Brittany frowned, clearly unsettled by my absolute lack of emotional response. She expected a broken victim, but she was looking at a brick wall. "Whatever, Claire," she scoffed, flipping her hair over her shoulder. "Enjoy your canned beans. Try not to embarrass the family name if you run into anyone else we know." They turned and walked away laughing together as they headed toward the checkout lines. I watched them go, maintaining my calm, serene smile. I pushed my cart to the register and paid for my cheap groceries entirely in small cash bills, keeping the performance flawless until the very end. I carried my plastic bags out to my rusted sedan and loaded them into the trunk. As I sat in the driver's seat waiting for the engine to warm up, I let out a low, dark laugh. Jamal and Brittany thought they were standing on top of the world. They thought their luxury real estate development was going to make them billionaires. They had absolutely no idea that the commercial property market was currently experiencing a massive underground shift. They had no idea that their lead developer was quietly funneling their construction loans into personal accounts. And most importantly, they had absolutely no idea that the woman they just mocked in the canned goods aisle was the anonymous private equity CEO who was currently positioning herself to buy their entire massive mountain of debt, the exact second their fraudulent house of cards inevitably collapsed. I put the car in gear and drove back to my hidden mansion, fully prepared to execute the final devastating phase of my master plan. Exactly 3 weeks after my encounter with Brittany and Jamal in the discount grocery store, the massive glittering house of cards they had built completely, violently collapsed. I was sitting at my mahogany desk in the secure offices of Phoenix Holdings, reviewing a fresh stack of commercial property acquisition files, when my lead corporate attorney walked into my office. He did not say a single word. He simply slid a confidential financial dossier across my desk and smiled a tight, predatory smile. I opened the file and read the executive summary. The lead developer for my family luxury real estate project, a charismatic fraudster who had promised them the moon, had vanished entirely. According to the urgent financial intelligence reports, the developer had quietly liquidated the project operational funds, transferred the massive construction loan payouts into untraceable offshore cryptocurrency accounts, and boarded a private jet to South America in the dead of night. He was gone, and he had taken every single penny of their heavily leveraged capital with him. The fallout was immediate and absolutely catastrophic. Within 48 hours, the luxury construction site was completely abandoned. Unpaid contractors walked off the job, taking their heavy machinery and locking the chain-link fences behind them. Suppliers filed massive mechanical liens against the unfinished property. The aggressive lenders who had financed their arrogant dream suddenly realized their prime collateral was rapidly turning into a worthless concrete skeleton. The bank immediately froze all associated credit lines and issued aggressive demands for immediate repayment. The financial shockwave hit my toxic family like a freight train. Greg was the first to feel the crushing blow of absolute ruin. The millions of dollars he had successfully stolen from me during our divorce, the tech shares he had laundered through my father's offshore accounts, had been completely wiped out. He had arrogantly poured every stolen cent into the real estate venture, believing it would make him a billionaire. Now he was officially left with absolutely nothing but an inflated lifestyle he could no longer afford, and a young, demanding wife who expected continuous luxury. Across town, Harrison faced total professional and financial annihilation. My brother had built his entire identity around being a ruthless elite finance executive. He had personally vouched for the absconded developer, using his corporate reputation to secure the massive mezzanine loans required for the project. When the fraud was exposed, his prestigious investment firm fired him immediately to distance themselves from the radioactive scandal. Harrison was escorted out of his glass corner office by security, carrying his belongings in a cardboard box, much like the garbage bags I had used when they threw me out into the freezing rain. The true depth of their shared panic culminated in a frantic closed-door family meeting at my parents' sprawling estate. I later received a full verified account of this disastrous gathering through a private investigator I had hired to monitor their legal exposure. Richard, Patricia Harrison, Brittany, Jamal, and Greg all gathered in the grand living room, the same room where my father had proudly grunted his approval of my suffering. Now the air in that room was thick with pure, unadulterated terror. The polished facade of family unity disintegrated instantly. They immediately turned on each other like starving wolves. Greg stood near the marble fireplace, screaming at my father with veins bulging in his neck. He blamed Richard for introducing him to the fraudulent developer demanding his stolen money back. Richard shouted right back, his face purple with stress, reminding Greg that he was the one who insisted on leveraging the offshore accounts to maximize their personal returns. Harrison paced the Persian rugs, pulling at his hair aggressively, cursing both of them for destroying his elite career. The Golden Child was currently facing potential federal investigations for his role in securing the fraudulent commercial loans. But the absolute worst realization of the night belonged to my mother and sister. During the height of their arrogant expansion, my father and Jamal had quietly restructured their financial portfolios to secure emergency bridge loans for the construction project. They needed massive amounts of liquid capital to keep the site operational while waiting for foreign investments to clear. To secure those risky bridge loans, Richard had put up the deed to his sprawling suburban mansion as direct collateral. Jamal, seeking to prove his worth to his wealthy father-in-law, had used Brittany Boutique and their personal townhouse to secure an additional line of credit. When the bank officially called in the defaulted loans, the brutal reality of their situation crashed down upon them. Patricia collapsed onto the expensive sofa, sobbing hysterically, as she realized the bank was actively preparing to foreclose on the very mansion she used to project her immense social superiority. She was going to lose her grand entryway, her 5 empty guest bedrooms, and her untouchable status at the country club. Brittany screamed at Jamal, hitting his chest with her fists, as she realized her boutique and her home were going to be seized by aggressive creditors. Jamal stood completely frozen, his smooth-talking public relations persona entirely shattered by the prospect of impending poverty. They were facing absolute universal ruin. The bank was initiating aggressive foreclosure proceedings on the unfinished commercial property, the family mansion, the boutique, and their private residences. Their personal bank accounts were heavily overdrawn. Their credit scores were plummeting into the abyss. They had absolutely no liquid cash left to hire the elite defense attorneys required to fight the aggressive banking institutions. They were drowning in a sea of toxic debt and legal liability. I sat in my secure office reading the investigator-detailed report of their complete financial destruction. I did not feel a single ounce of pity for the people screaming and crying in that mansion. They were finally experiencing the exact same suffocating terror they had forced upon me and my children. They were learning the hard lesson about consequences that my father had so coldly preached to me on his porch. But I knew the bank was moving too slowly. The institutional lenders would tie the properties up in bureaucratic red tape for months before officially seizing them. I did not want them to wait months. I wanted to control their execution directly. I picked up my desk phone and called my lead corporate attorney. I told him to contact the banking consortium holding my family toxic loans. It was time for Phoenix Holdings to make an aggressive anonymous acquisition. My lead corporate attorney moved with the ruthless speed and absolute discretion I demanded. The institutional lenders holding my family's massive defaulted loans were in a state of sheer panic. Banks absolutely despise holding on to toxic, unfinished commercial real estate and highly leveraged residential mortgages. They wanted the bad debt wiped off their quarterly balance sheets immediately before the federal regulators started asking uncomfortable questions. My attorney approached the banking consortium, representing an anonymous billionaire investment firm looking to make a bulk acquisition. The negotiation was swift and brutal. We did not offer them anywhere near the original value of the loans. We offered them pennies on the dollar, proposing a rapid all-cash buyout that would instantly relieve them of the bureaucratic nightmare. Within 72 hours, the banking executives eagerly signed the transfer documents. The ink dried, and the massive wire transfer cleared my offshore accounts. I sat at my desk and reviewed the finalized legal portfolio handed to me by my attorney. The sheer magnitude of the power shift sent a thrilling jolt of adrenaline straight through my veins. I was no longer just an estranged daughter or a discarded ex-wife. I was officially their primary creditor. I legally held the mortgage to my father's sprawling suburban mansion. I personally owned the massive commercial loan that had bankrupted Harrison and Greg. I possessed the direct deed to Brittany's failing boutique and Jamal's private townhouse. I held their entire existence in the palm of my hand. If I snapped my fingers, they would be sleeping on metal cots in a shelter by Friday. But foreclosing on them quietly through the mail was entirely too merciful. I needed them to orchestrate their own spectacular public execution. The legal notification of the debt transfer arrived at my father's mansion via certified mail 2 days later. The documents coldly informed Richard Harrison, Greg, and Jamal that their entire portfolio of debt had been officially acquired by a private equity firm named Phoenix Holdings. The banking consortium was entirely out of the picture. They now answered exclusively to an anonymous billionaire CEO. According to my private investigator, the arrival of that letter sparked a massive wave of renewed desperation inside the family estate. They feverishly researched Phoenix Holdings, but my corporate shielding was absolutely impenetrable. They found no names, no faces, and zero contact information beyond a sterile corporate P.O. box in Delaware and the name of my proxy legal firm. They were completely backed into a corner, and their massive egos refused to let them simply surrender and declare bankruptcy. They firmly believed that their superior social status and smooth-talking charm could rescue them from any consequence. Jamal, leaning heavily into his public relations background, pitched a wildly desperate and incredibly arrogant survival strategy. He convinced my father and Greg that the anonymous CEO of Phoenix Holdings was likely a ruthless but highly ambitious investor who could be flattered and manipulated. Jamal proposed they host an extravagant high society charity gala right inside my father's sprawling mansion. The plan was incredibly transparent. They intended to use the last remaining shreds of their dwindling credit to throw a massive opulent party, inviting the wealthiest elite in the city, under the guise of raising funds for a local children's hospital. But the actual sole purpose of the event was to lure the mysterious owner of Phoenix Holdings into their home. They planned to roll out the red carpet shower the CEO with flattery and pitch them a massive equity partnership in the failed commercial development. They genuinely believed they could convince this anonymous billionaire to forgive their toxic debt, inject fresh capital into the project, and save their entire glittering empire. It was a stunning display of pure delusion. They were practically drowning in debt, yet they were actively ordering expensive catered appetizers and renting crystal chandeliers to impress the very executioner holding the axe over their heads. A week later, a heavy cream-colored envelope arrived at my attorney's office. He brought it directly to my desk unopened. I sliced through the thick wax seal with my silver letter opener. Inside was a lavishly embossed VIP invitation to the inaugural Watson Family Charity Gala. The invitation was addressed specifically to the Chief Executive Officer of Phoenix Holdings. The attached handwritten note, penned in my mother's elegant sweeping cursive, practically begged for the honor of my distinguished presence. She wrote about how much my visionary firm could achieve by partnering with their prestigious family legacy. She promised an evening of unparalleled luxury and elite networking. I ran my fingers over the raised gold lettering of my mother's extravagant invitation. She was begging me to come save her. She was throwing a lavish party specifically designed to worship the ground I walked on. She had absolutely no idea she had just sent a gilded invitation to the daughter she threw into the freezing rain. I picked up my desk phone and called my elite personal stylist. I told her I needed a custom-tailored designer gown that commanded absolute authority. I needed a dress that looked like pure weaponized wealth. Then I called my private security detail and instructed them to prepare a sleek, black armored luxury vehicle for the upcoming weekend. Greg Richard, Patricia Harrison, Brittany, and Jamal had spent the last 2 years mocking my supposed poverty. They had laughed at my generic groceries and sneered at my thrift store shoes. They had happily spent the money they stole from my children to build a house of cards they thought would touch the sky. They were about to learn exactly who owned the wind. I placed the cream-colored invitation carefully into my leather briefcase. The trap was set perfectly. The entire city elite would be gathered in one room to witness the grand finale. I was going to accept their gracious invitation, and I was going to burn their fake empire straight to the ground in front of every single person they were desperately trying to impress. The night of the gala arrived with a sharp, biting chill that completely failed to cool the desperate, sweating panic radiating inside my father's sprawling mansion. The grand estate was illuminated by massive rented spotlights sweeping aggressively across the manicured lawns. Dozens of valets in crisp white uniforms rushed to open doors for the city elite, who arrived in a steady, endless stream of luxury vehicles. Inside the towering foyer, a string quartet played elegant classical music, while waiters circulated smoothly with silver trays of expensive champagne and imported caviar. It was a flawless, desperate projection of immense wealth and unbothered success. But beneath the glittering crystal chandeliers, the tension rolling off my family was absolutely suffocating. Their entire financial survival rested entirely on the events of tonight. If the mysterious CEO of Phoenix Holdings did not arrive and offer them a miraculous immediate bailout, they would all be completely legally ruined by Monday morning. Standing near the base of the massive curved staircase, Jamal was already holding court. He wore a flashy velvet tuxedo jacket and held a crystal tumbler of expensive scotch, gesturing grandly as he spoke to a group of wealthy local investors. His public relations persona was operating at maximum desperate capacity. He boasted loudly about his exclusive corporate connections, claiming his brilliant strategic outreach was the sole reason the elusive representative from Phoenix Holdings had officially RSVP'd to the event. He laughed his booming fake laugh, assuring the wide-eyed investors that a massive corporate partnership with the billionaire firm was virtually guaranteed by the end of the night. Harrison stood nervously nearby, sweating profusely through his custom-tailored suit. My brother nodded along blindly with Jamal's fabricated story, while frantically checking his expensive watch every single minute. My father, Richard, paced anxiously near the grand glass entrance. He forced tight, desperate smiles at the arriving guests, while his panicked eyes constantly darted toward the long driveway. They were eagerly waiting for a savior to walk through those doors. They were waiting for me. Precisely at 8 o'clock, my private security team pulled my sleek black armored luxury vehicle directly up to the front marble steps of the mansion. The vehicle was entirely imposing, an absolute rolling fortress of heavily tinted glass and polished black steel that instantly commanded the attention of every single person standing near the grand entrance. The valets physically hesitated, clearly unsure of how to properly handle a security vehicle that completely outclassed everything else parked in the circular driveway. My lead security officer, a towering man in a sharp black suit, stepped out of the driver's seat. He walked around to the rear passenger door, moving with sharp, intimidating military precision. The polite chatter near the entryway abruptly died down. Guests turned their heads eagerly, anticipating the grand arrival of the anonymous billionaire investor Jamal had been loudly promising all evening. The heavy armored door swung open, and I stepped out into the bright, sweeping glare of the rented spotlights. I did not look anything like the exhausted, broken woman they had violently thrown into the freezing rain 2 years ago. I did not look like the destitute single mother pushing a squeaky shopping cart full of generic canned beans they had mocked at the discount store. My custom-tailored designer gown was an absolute masterpiece of midnight blue silk that moved like dark liquid glass around my body. It was cut with severe, elegant lines that projected absolute ruthless authority. Rare, flawless diamonds glittered brightly at my throat and wrists, catching the harsh spotlights and refracting them back into the stunned faces of the waiting crowd. I stood perfectly tall, my posture completely unyielding, my expression a mask of cold, serene, unbreakable power. I was no longer the victim they had created. I was the architect of their impending destruction. My mother, Patricia, was standing near the coat check greeting a prominent local politician. The exact second her eyes locked onto me, her expensive champagne flute slipped completely from her fingers and shattered violently against the polished marble floor. Richard froze completely in his tracks, his face draining of all color as he stared at me in pure, unadulterated shock. Jamal stopped speaking mid-sentence, his mouth hanging wide open as his wealthy audience turned away from him to watch my spectacular entrance. The silence in the grand foyer was absolute. The pure shock gripping my family rapidly morphed into blinding, indignant fury. In their deeply arrogant and desperate minds, there was only one possible logical explanation for my unexpected presence. They instantly assumed I had somehow discovered the charity gala, rented a fake designer dress from a cheap costume shop, and aggressively crashed their exclusive event to publicly beg for handout money or intentionally sabotage their delicate networking efforts. I could see the panicked gears turning furiously in my father's eyes. He saw my arrival as a direct threat to the fake illusion of wealth he was desperately trying to sell to the anonymous CEO he thought was still on the way. Harrison immediately broke away from the group of investors, his face twisting into a mask of pure, hateful rage. He began marching aggressively toward the front doors, clearly intending to physically intercept me before I could step fully into the grand foyer. Brittany appeared beside my mother, her eyes narrowing as she took in the sight of my diamonds and my tailored silk gown. She scoffed loudly, clearly, believing my entire presentation was a pathetic, desperate lie. They all mobilized simultaneously, moving quickly to form a hostile barricade at the entrance. They fully intended to humiliate me, grab me by the arm and throw me right back out into the cold night, just like they had done before. I watched them rush toward me with an entirely calm, steady heart. I walked gracefully up the marble steps, my heels clicking sharply against the cold stone, ready to face the absolute wrath of my toxic family. I confidently stepped across the polished brass threshold and entered the beautifully decorated grand foyer. The heavy oak door that had been violently slammed in my face 2 years ago was now held wide open by a bewildered valet. My mother, Patricia, aggressively blocked my path, her face completely contorted in panic and rage. She grabbed my arm, her fingers digging into my silk sleeve. She leaned close, her expensive perfume failing to mask the sour smell of desperation. She hissed, demanding to know what I thought I was doing, crashing her charity event. She furiously ordered me to leave the premises immediately before I completely humiliated the entire family. I very calmly pulled my arm completely free from her desperate grasp. I did not break eye contact. I signaled a passing waiter and smoothly lifted a crystal flute of champagne from his silver tray. I took a slow sip, holding my ground absolutely perfectly. Brittany and Jamal immediately closed in, forming a tight, hostile circle completely around me. Brittany looked me up and down with exaggerated disgust. She let out a mocking laugh, pointing a finger at my diamond necklace, and loudly asked which thrift store I had rented the fake jewelry from. She sneered that my dress looked like a cheap knockoff, and told me I was making a pathetic spectacle of myself. She reminded me this was a high society gala, not a soup kitchen line for destitute single mothers. Jamal stepped forward, his face hard and aggressive. He lowered his voice, telling me I was jeopardizing a multi-million-dollar opportunity. He grabbed my elbow and tried to steer me away from the ballroom. He told me if I was desperate for a free meal, I needed to enter through the back door to the kitchen. He said he would ask the staff to scrape some leftover appetizers into a plastic container so I could feed my kids, but I had to get out immediately. I stood absolutely motionless. I did not raise my voice. I did not try to pull away. I simply stared at Jamal's hand on my arm with such cold, lethal intensity that he instinctively let go and took a step back. I took another sip of champagne. I was enjoying their panic. Their insults were powerless against me now. They were throwing paper darts at a titanium wall. A familiar, obnoxious laugh cut through the tense air. Greg strolled over from the direction of the open bar, a fresh cocktail in his hand. He was wearing an expensive tuxedo that I knew he could no longer afford. He was flanked by Ashley, wearing a revealing red dress, entirely inappropriate for a formal charity gala. Greg looked me up and down, his eyes wide with arrogant amusement. He let out a loud, booming laugh that caused several nearby guests to turn their heads in our direction. Greg loudly declared that he could not believe my sheer unmitigated audacity. He turned to Jamal and Brittany, chuckling as he mocked my sudden presence. He asked them how I managed to get past the front gate security in my rusted-out sedan. Ashley giggled maliciously, leaning her head on Greg's shoulder. She looked at my midnight blue silk gown and snidely commented that I must have maxed out another credit card just to play dress-up for the night. She told me it was genuinely sad to see a middle-aged woman trying so hard to fit into a world she clearly did not belong in. Greg stepped closer, his breath smelling heavily of expensive gin and profound arrogance. He leaned down, invading my personal space, attempting to use his physical presence to intimidate me just like he had done during our toxic marriage. He whispered harshly that my attempt to infiltrate the city elite was entirely pathetic. He reminded me that I was a bankrupt estate liquidator who sorted through dead people's trash. He told me I was a complete failure who had lost her home, lost her husband, and was now desperately begging for scraps at a party I was not invited to. He told me to turn around, walk straight back out into the freezing cold, and go right back to my miserable little life before he had the armed security guards physically throw me out onto the street. I let them talk. I stood in the center of their hostile circle and allowed them to completely exhaust their vicious insults. I listened to every single cruel word, every mocking laugh, and every desperate threat. I let them empty their entire arsenal of hatred because I wanted them to remember exactly how arrogant they were in this specific moment. I wanted them to remember their total, absolute confidence. The music in the grand ballroom swelled, indicating the main speeches were about to begin. The wealthy investors and politicians started moving away from the foyer and toward the seating area. My father, Richard, appeared at the edge of our circle looking frantic and sweating heavily. He hissed at Greg to get me out of sight because the Phoenix representative was arriving. I finished my glass of champagne. I gently placed the empty crystal flute onto a passing waiter's tray. I smoothed an invisible wrinkle from my flawless silk skirt. I looked up, meeting the angry, desperate eyes of my mother, my father, my brother, my sister, my brother-in-law, my ex-husband, and his mistress. I let a slow, lethal smile spread across my face. "I am not here to beg for food," I said, my voice perfectly calm, perfectly clear, and echoing loudly enough for the straggling guests to hear. "I am not here to ruin your desperate little party tonight. I am just here to meet the new owner." I did not wait for their confused reactions. I smoothly stepped around my frozen mother, parted the hostile barricade of my family, and walked directly into the grand ballroom, ready to officially claim my empire. The grand ballroom was a masterclass in aggressive financial posturing. Massive crystal chandeliers cast a warm golden light over dozens of perfectly arranged circular tables. The city elite mingled in their expensive tuxedos and designer gowns, completely unaware of the absolute financial bloodbath hovering directly over the heads of their hosts. I glided across the polished hardwood floor, moving with the calm, deliberate grace of a woman who owned every single brick of the building. I found a shadowed alcove near the front of the room, a vantage point that offered a perfect, unobstructed view of the main stage. My family scrambled into the room right behind me. I could feel their furious, panicked eyes burning into my back, but they were completely trapped by their own desperate need to maintain public decorum. They could not risk dragging me out, kicking and screaming in front of the exact investors they needed to impress. They were forced to stand near the side exit, seething in silent, agonizing impotence, while I stood comfortably near the VIP tables. The soft, classical music abruptly faded. A sharp feedback whine echoed through the tall speakers, signaling the beginning of the formal presentations. The crowd murmured and slowly took their designated seats. My father, Richard, walked up the side stairs to the raised mahogany stage. The harsh spotlight hit him directly, and the illusion of his untouchable power instantly cracked. He was sweating profusely. I could see the damp patches forming under the arms of his custom-tailored suit jacket. He gripped the edges of the wooden podium so hard his knuckles turned completely white. His breathing was shallow and rapid. He looked like a man standing on a trapdoor waiting for the hangman to pull the lever. But Richard was a seasoned veteran of corporate manipulation. He plastered a wide, artificial smile across his face and leaned into the microphone. His voice boomed out over the silent ballroom, heavily laced with forced, cheerful arrogance. "Ladies and gentlemen, esteemed colleagues, and dearest friends," he began, his voice echoing off the high vaulted ceilings. "Thank you for gathering in our home tonight to celebrate the enduring legacy of the Watson family. We have always believed that true wealth is not measured simply by financial returns, but by the strength of our community and the unbreakable bonds of family unity." I almost laughed out loud at the staggering hypocrisy. The man standing on that stage preaching about unbreakable family bonds was the exact same man who had looked at his freezing, terrified grandchildren and slammed the door in their faces. He continued his desperate performance, spinning a masterful web of lies. As many of you know, we have embarked on our most ambitious commercial real estate development to date, a project that will completely redefine the skyline of this city and cement our family legacy for generations to come. Now, building an empire is never an easy endeavor. We have weathered some recent economic storms and faced temporary logistical setbacks. He smoothly glossed over the fact that their lead developer had stolen their entire investment and fled the country, leaving them drowning in toxic debt. "But a strong family never retreats from a challenge," Richard proclaimed, raising his fist in a manufactured display of absolute triumph. "We stand together, we fight together, and we build the future together." Tonight marks a brand new chapter of extraordinary prosperity for our real estate venture. The audience erupted into polite, enthusiastic applause. Richard wiped a heavy bead of sweat from his forehead using a silk pocket square. He looked frantically around the room, his eyes scanning the tables, searching desperately for the anonymous savior he fully believed was sitting among the crowd. He did not look at me. I was entirely invisible to him in the shadows, just another piece of the background. Richard leaned back into the microphone. "And now, to share the specifics of our tremendous leap forward, I would like to introduce our lead corporate attorney." A tall, thin man with slicked back hair and wire-rimmed glasses confidently strode up to the podium. Richard shook his hand vigorously, stepping aside but remaining on the stage. The attorney tapped the microphone, beaming down at the wealthy investors. "Good evening, everyone," the attorney said, his voice ringing with genuine excitement. "I have the distinct honor of sharing some absolutely spectacular financial news tonight. As Richard mentioned, the commercial real estate market can be turbulent, but true visionary assets always attract elite institutional backing. I am thrilled to officially announce that our luxury development project has not only been secured, but it has been completely revitalized." The crowd leaned forward, captivated by the announcement. Just 48 hours ago, the attorney continued, an exclusive private equity firm recognized the immense, unprecedented value of the Watson family vision. They have stepped in with an aggressive all-cash acquisition. I am proud to confirm that Phoenix Holdings has officially purchased all outstanding commercial debt construction loans and associated mortgage notes connected to the project. They have completely bought out the original banking consortium. The room broke into a wave of impressed murmurs and scattered clapping. "Phoenix Holdings is a titan of industry," the attorney boasted loudly. "Having a firm of their astronomical wealth and absolute discretion take over the debt means this project is fully saved. It means the Watson family vision is completely secure. We are no longer dealing with hesitant bureaucratic banks. We are now directly partnered with a singular, brilliant visionary." The relief radiating from my family standing near the exits was practically tangible. Jamal slapped Harrison on the back. My mother placed a hand over her heart, exhaling a massive breath. Greg smiled, his arrogant, smug smile wrapping his arm tightly around Ashley. They genuinely believed they had won. They thought they were saved. The attorney adjusted his wire-rimmed glasses and offered the crowd a bright, polished smile. He leaned closer to the microphone, letting the anticipation build perfectly within the grand ballroom. "We are incredibly fortunate tonight," he announced, his voice practically vibrating with absolute reverence. "The sole owner and chief executive officer of Phoenix Holdings is an individual who notoriously prefers to operate entirely outside of the public eye. This brilliant investor built a massive empire through pure, ruthless intuition and flawless execution. They rarely attend social functions and never grant press interviews. Having them here is an unprecedented honor for the Watson family. I watched my father Richard puff out his chest on the stage. He adjusted his silk tie, completely intoxicated by the flattering words. He genuinely believed his family name possessed such immense magnetic prestige that it successfully lured a reclusive billionaire out of the shadows. By the side exit, Greg pulled Ashley closer, wearing a wide, victorious grin. Jamal nodded knowingly to a nearby investor, claiming silent credit for securing this mythical savior. They were all collectively bathing in the glow of a victory that did not actually exist. The attorney extended his hand toward the back of the massive ballroom. "Ladies and gentlemen," he declared, his voice rising to a dramatic crescendo. The CEO requested that their identity remain completely anonymous until this exact moment. Please direct your attention to the rear alcove and join me in offering a deeply grateful, spectacular welcome to the sole owner of Phoenix Holdings, the absolute savior of the Watson Commercial Development Project. He signaled the rented lighting technician stationed in the balcony. A massive, high-powered spotlight instantly cut through the dim, golden atmosphere of the ballroom. The bright white beam swept aggressively over the tables of wealthy politicians and elite business owners. The crowd turned eagerly, their expensive jewelry catching the sweeping light as they searched for the mysterious titan of industry. The piercing beam stopped dead in its tracks. It locked directly onto my shadowed alcove. The blinding light hit my midnight blue designer silk gown and the flawless diamonds resting against my collarbone. I did not flinch or shield my eyes. I stood perfectly still, holding my chin high, staring straight ahead with cold, lethal, absolute authority. I was illuminated for the entire room to see. The billionaire savior they were all waiting to worship was the exact same woman they had mocked, humiliated, and discarded. For one brief, agonizing second, the entire ballroom was paralyzed by absolute total confusion. The elite guests who had witnessed my family aggressively cornering me in the grand foyer stared at me in profound bewilderment. They recognized me as the unwanted intruder, the allegedly destitute relative who had been ordered to enter through the back kitchen door. Now I was standing firmly in the center of the savior spotlight. Then the devastating truth of the attorney's introduction violently crashed down upon my family. The reaction was immediate and absolutely catastrophic. The silence that fell over the sprawling ballroom was not just quiet, it was deafening. It was the suffocating, heavy silence of a bomb dropping right before the shockwave obliterates everything in its path. Standing near the side exit, Jamal completely lost his grip on reality. The expensive crystal tumbler of scotch slipped right through his trembling fingers. It hit the polished hardwood floor and shattered into 100 jagged pieces. The sharp, violent sound of breaking glass echoed like a gunshot through the silent room, but nobody even blinked. They were transfixed by the unfolding horror. Greg looked like he had been physically struck by a speeding freight train. All the blood completely drained from his face, leaving his skin a sickly, chalky white. His arrogant, smug smirk melted into an expression of pure, unadulterated terror. He stared at my designer gown and the blinding diamonds, recognizing instantly that the destitute, homeless mother he had tortured in family court was a carefully constructed illusion. His mouth hung open, entirely slack. His knees visibly buckled, causing Ashley to stagger as he desperately leaned his heavy weight against the wall to keep from collapsing. He realized that he had handed his entire stolen fortune directly over to the woman he abused. On the stage, the illusion of my father's untouchable power shattered into dust. Richard gripped the sides of the heavy wooden podium so fiercely his hands violently shook. He stopped breathing. His chest heaved as he stared down at me through the blinding beam of the spotlight. His mind frantically tried to reject the impossible reality standing before him. The daughter he had brutally locked out in the freezing winter rain, the daughter he had called a complete embarrassment and a worthless failure, was the anonymous predator who had systematically bought up every single cent of his toxic debt. Patricia let out a loud, strangled, breathless gasp, pressing both hands hard against her mouth to stifle a scream. Harrison leaned heavily against a marble pillar, looking like he was going to violently throw up. Brittany stumbled backward, her eyes wide with frantic horror, completely terrified by the woman she had just mocked in the foyer. I stepped slowly out of the illuminated alcove. I began my walk down the wide center aisle of the ballroom. I moved with deliberate, agonizingly slow precision. Every single click of my designer heels against the hardwood floor echoed loudly in the dead silent room, ringing out like the steady ticking of a lethal countdown. The sea of wealthy investors and elite socialites automatically parted for me. They stepped back, creating a wide, clear path as they finally understood the terrifying power dynamic shifting right in front of their eyes. They whispered frantically to each other, recognizing that the Watson family had completely surrendered their entire empire to a predator they had invited straight into their own home. I reached the front, placing my hand on the polished mahogany stage stairs. I stepped up the wooden stairs, moving with absolute lethal grace until I stood directly beside my father. Richard was completely paralyzed. His expensive suit was soaked in cold sweat, and his hands were locked onto the podium in a death grip. I did not wait for an invitation. I simply reached out and firmly pulled the microphone away from his trembling fingers. The harsh spotlight hit my face, casting long, dramatic shadows across the silent stage. "Good evening, everyone," I said. My voice was smooth, perfectly measured, and completely devoid of any mercy. The acoustics of the grand ballroom carried every single syllable to the furthest corners of the room. My father and his attorney just promised you a miraculous financial salvation. They told you Phoenix Holdings acquired their toxic debt out of profound respect for the Watson family legacy. They lied to you. I did not buy their massive defaulted loans to save their sinking ship. I bought them to ensure their ship hit the bottom of the ocean. A collective gasp rippled through the wealthy crowd. Down by the side exit, I watched Greg physically slump against the wall, looking like a dead man walking. "I am the sole owner of Phoenix Holdings," I announced, staring directly into the sea of shocked faces. "I am also the daughter this family violently threw out into a freezing winter storm 2 years ago when I begged them for basic shelter for my 3 young children. They mocked my career. They stole my marital assets to fund this arrogant, disastrous luxury development. Now they stand before you entirely bankrupt, begging a ghost to save their fraudulent empire." I turned slowly to face Richard. He looked completely broken, his eyes wide with desperate, pleading terror. I leaned back into the microphone. "I am not here to fund your failed luxury project, Richard. I am here to collect. As the primary legal creditor of this estate, I am executing the immediate complete foreclosure on the commercial development. I am seizing all construction assets. Furthermore, I am executing the immediate foreclosure on this exact mansion and accelerating the collection of Harrison's defaulted personal assets used as cross-collateral." The ballroom absolutely exploded into a chaotic symphony of frantic whispers and shocked outcries. Wealthy socialites covered their mouths in profound horror. Institutional investors aggressively backed away from my family members, treating them like infectious financial diseases. Jamal stared blindly at his broken glass, realizing his entire public relations career was completely annihilated. Brittany clutched her fake designer purse, loudly sobbing, as her boutique vanished forever. The absolute reality of their destruction finally crashed down upon them. They were completely legally bankrupt. Every single penny they possessed, every piece of property they desperately clung to project their fake superiority, now legally belonged to the very woman they had discarded in the rain. I handed the microphone back to my gasping, terrified father, offering him a cold, dead smile. The trap had forcefully snapped shut. Panic rippled through the grand ballroom like a physical wave. The city elite, politicians, and wealthy investors did not wait for a formal dismissal. They scrambled for the exits with desperate urgency. Chairs scraped violently against the polished hardwood floors. Designer heels clattered toward the grand foyer as people practically shoved each other out of the way to escape the blast radius of my family's financial annihilation. Nobody wanted to be associated with a bankrupt, fraudulent enterprise. Within 10 short minutes, the venue was empty. The waitstaff vanished, terrified of the drama. The heavy oak doors clicked shut, sealing my family and Greg inside the ruins of their own lavish party. The silence that followed was suffocating. The sudden, violent shift in power created absolute chaos. My mother, Patricia, was the first to completely break. The woman who orchestrated my exclusion let out a theatrical sob. She stumbled forward and collapsed at the stage stairs. She reached out with trembling hands, trying to grab the hem of my silk gown. I took one deliberate step back, refusing to let her touch me. Patricia stared up at me with mascara running down her face. "Claire, my beautiful girl," she wailed, her voice cracking with manufactured desperation. "You cannot do this to us. We are your family. We are your own flesh and blood. You belong with us." She frantically tried to rewrite history. She claimed she had always known I was brilliant, that pushing me out was just tough love, designed to make me strong. She sobbed, begging me to remember she was my mother. I looked down at her, completely unmoved. "Blood does not abandon blood in a freezing storm," I reminded her coldly. "Blood does not laugh while children shiver in a car. You lost the right to use that word 2 years ago." My father Richard stepped forward next. The arrogant, untouchable patriarch was completely gone. His shoulders slumped as his chest heaved with panicked breaths. He approached the stage, refusing to meet my eyes. He lowered his head, completely abandoning the towering pride he had weaponized against me my entire life. He looked like a beaten, terrified old man. He cleared his throat, but his corporate negotiating voice came out as a pathetic rasp. "Claire, please listen to reason," Richard begged, his hands shaking. "We can make a deal. You are a businesswoman now. Let me run the commercial project for you. Let me salvage the retail spaces. I know the local zoning laws. I know the contractors. I can work for you, Claire. Just please do not foreclose on this house. I built this estate. Your mother cannot survive living in a cheap apartment. Name your price. Take 90% of the profits. Just leave us our home." I stared at the man who had slammed this exact front door in my face when I begged for a single guest room. "You have absolutely nothing left to negotiate with, Richard," I stated flatly. "You are not a developer anymore. You are just a man squatting in my house." Suddenly, a loud scuffle broke out near the side exit. Greg, my arrogant, abusive ex-husband, completely snapped under the weight of his own destruction. Ashley, his young wife, grabbed his arm, crying and demanding to know what was going to happen to her expensive lifestyle. In a display of pure, unadulterated cowardice, Greg violently shoved her away. Ashley stumbled backward, her high heels twisting, and she fell hard onto the polished floor, letting out a sharp shriek of surprise and pain. Greg did not even glance back at her. He sprinted toward the stage, his eyes wide with frantic, absolute terror. He threw himself at the base of the wooden stairs and literally fell to his knees. The man who had sneered at me in family court, the man who had hidden millions of dollars to leave me destitute, was now crawling on the floor at my feet. "Claire, you have to listen to me," Greg pleaded, clasping his hands together in a pathetic prayer. I was out of my mind. I was completely brainwashed. He pointed a shaking finger directly at my father. "Richard manipulated me. He told me to hide the money. He told me you were trying to ruin my career. I never wanted to take the kids from you. They forced me to do it." Greg scrambled closer, looking up at me with wide, desperate eyes. "I always loved you, Claire. You have to believe me. Ashley meant absolutely nothing to me. She was just a mistake. We can fix this. We can take the kids and move into this mansion together. We can be a real family again. I will do whatever you want. I will grovel every single day. Just please take me back. Do not leave me with nothing. I gave up everything for this project." The sheer pathetic nature of his public display made my stomach churn with disgust. I looked past him to where Harrison, Brittany, and Jamal stood completely frozen near the catering tables. Harrison was hyperventilating, loosening his silk tie, his face completely pale as he realized his elite career was truly dead. Brittany was weeping into Jamal's shoulder, while Jamal stared at me with pure paralyzing fear, knowing his public relations empire had just been exposed as a total fraud. The entire room was a masterpiece of absolute devastation. The people who had built their identities on crushing my spirit were now trapped in a cage of their own making. They were crying, begging, and turning on each other like starving animals. They had expected me to fold, to show mercy, to be the weak, compliant woman they had conditioned me to be. But the woman standing before them was forged in the freezing rain they had abandoned me in. I looked down at Greg kneeling on the floor, and then at my parents waiting for my final judgment. I took a deep breath, fully ready to deliver their final absolute ruin. I looked down at Greg kneeling on the polished hardwood floor and felt absolutely zero pity. The man who had deliberately orchestrated my homelessness was now clutching his hands together, sobbing and pleading for a second chance. I stepped down from the stage, my designer heels clicking sharply against the wood. I stood directly over him, forcing him to crane his neck backward to meet my gaze. I did not raise my voice. I did not yell. My tone was terrifyingly calm. I dismantled his pathetic excuses with clinical precision. I told Greg that nobody brainwashed him. I reminded him that he was the one who changed the locks. He was the one who laughed while throwing a massive credit card bill at my chest. He was the one who dragged my name through the mud in family court, actively trying to rip Leo, Mia, and Sam out of my arms. I looked him dead in the eye and told him his cowardly attempt to blame my father changed absolutely nothing. He was a grown man who made a calculated choice to destroy his family for a young intern. Greg desperately reached for the hem of my dress, repeating that he still had assets. He frantically claimed he could transfer the tech shares he hid in my father's offshore accounts back to me. He promised he would sign over every single penny to prove his loyalty. I let out a sharp, genuinely amused laugh. The sound echoed through the silent ballroom, causing Greg to freeze. I looked down at his panicked face and delivered the absolute financial death blow. I explained the reality of his toxic investments. When Greg and my father over-leveraged their assets to secure the massive construction loans for their luxury development, they used those hidden offshore accounts as primary collateral. They signed binding legal agreements guaranteeing the debt with those exact tech shares. I leaned down, looking directly into Greg's terrified eyes. I told him that when Phoenix Holdings acquired their defaulted commercial loans, I did not just buy the concrete skeleton of their failed project. I bought every single piece of collateral attached to it. Those offshore shares did not belong to him anymore. They did not belong to my father. They legally belonged to my private equity firm. I told Greg he was officially worth absolutely nothing. He had zero cash, zero assets, and zero leverage. He was completely broke. Greg collapsed backwards, sitting hard on the floor. His mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. The absolute finality of his financial ruin paralyzed him completely. Ashley watched him from the floor where he had shoved her, her face twisted in utter disgust, as she realized she was now tied to a penniless, bankrupt fraud. I turned my back on Greg, entirely dismissing his existence. I walked slowly toward my family. Patricia scrambled backward, hitting the base of the stage, her hands trembling wildly. Richard stood rigidly beside her, his face completely pale. Harrison, who had mocked my urgent phone call 2 years ago, stood frozen near the catering tables. Brittany and Jamal huddled together, terrified of making eye contact with me. I stopped right in front of my father. I looked at the man who had always demanded absolute perfection and ruthless success. He was shaking violently. I looked at my mother, who had actively enabled every single ounce of my suffering. I looked at Harrison, who had coldly cited his expensive furniture as a reason to let his niece and nephews sleep in a freezing car. I systematically dismantled their lifelong delusion of superiority. I told them their entire empire was built on fraud, theft, and sheer arrogant stupidity. I reminded them that they had spent decades calling me a failure simply because I refused to play their toxic games. They thought their wealth made them untouchable gods. But their wealth was an illusion, and I was the one who finally shattered it. Patricia reached out again, crying hysterically. "Claire, please," she wailed. "Where will we go? What will we do? We have nowhere to live. We have absolutely nothing left. You cannot just throw us out onto the street. We are your blood." I looked them dead in the eye. I let the silence stretch out, forcing them to absorb the exact level of desperation they were feeling. I let them taste the exact same bitter terror I had choked on when I sat in my old sedan, watching the rain lash against the windshield. I looked directly at my father, then my mother, then my brother. I kept my voice incredibly soft, but laced with absolute lethal steel. "There is no space for you here," I said, echoing the exact words they had used to destroy me. "Try calling an Uber." Richard let out a broken, strangled gasp. Harrison closed his eyes in pure defeat. I signaled my lead corporate attorney, who was standing silently in the shadows. He stepped forward, carrying a stack of thick legal envelopes. He handed them directly to me. Moving with deliberate, unhurried grace, I handed one envelope to Richard. I handed one to Harrison. I handed one to Brittany and Jamal. I dropped one on the floor directly onto Greg's lap. I informed them that these were official notarized eviction notices and immediate asset seizure declarations. As the sole legal owner of the debt, holding the deeds to the sprawling mansion, the luxury townhouse, the boutique, and the commercial site, I was executing my right to take immediate possession. I told them they had exactly 3 days to pack their personal belongings and vacate my properties. If they left a single piece of trash behind or caused any damage to the estates, my lawyers would pursue aggressive criminal destruction charges. If they were still standing on my property at dawn on Tuesday morning, I would have them physically removed by armed private security and arrested for trespassing. They had absolutely no defense. They had no money for lawyers. They had no powerful friends left to bail them out. I did not wait for their useless apologies. I turned my back on them and walked out the grand front doors. The profound story of Claire's transformation from a discarded homeless mother into an untouchable corporate CEO offers a visceral lesson on the illusion of unconditional familial loyalty and the absolute necessity of self-reliance. For decades, society has conditioned us to believe that blood ties demand perpetual forgiveness, pressuring us to endure emotional abuse and manipulation simply to maintain a fabricated image of family harmony. However, Claire's harrowing journey teaches us that true peace does not come from passive submission to toxic people. It requires the immense courage to draw ironclad boundaries and systematically take back your power. When Claire's husband betrayed her and her wealthy parents locked her out in a freezing storm, they expected her to crumble into a lifetime of subservience and failure. They actively thrived on her misery to validate their own narcissistic superiority. Yet their profound cruelty became the very catalyst for her monumental rebirth. Instead of wasting her energy begging for basic human decency from people incapable of providing it, she channeled her devastation into a quiet, relentless grind. She realized that trying to earn the approval of those who actively enjoyed her suffering was a futile battle. The ultimate lesson here is that our self-worth is never determined by the people who fail to appreciate us. Healing and justice sometimes mean accepting that the people meant to protect you are the ones you must protect yourself from. By stripping away her family's financial leverage and evicting them from her life, Claire did not just exact revenge. She secured an unbreakable, thriving future for her children. True karma is not merely a mystical force, but something built through silent strategy and the absolute refusal to remain a victim. If you are currently surviving in a toxic dynamic, stop waiting for your abusers to change and take the first step today to silently build your own unshakable independence.